Officer Daniels thought he was untouchable. For years, he had bullied, harassed, and abused his power, especially against black people. So when he saw a black woman in court, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed her, pushed her, and humiliated her in front of the judge, in front of witnesses. He made sure she knew who was in charge. But then, she reached into her jacket and pulled out a badge. The courtroom fell silent. Daniels staggered back, his face turning pale, because this wasn't just any black woman. The truth frees everyone. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the judge prepared to give the final ruling. Officer Daniels stood with his usual smug arrogance, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He had done this dozens of times before, testified against people he had arrested, many of whom had the misfortune of being black in a city where cops like him thrived on unchecked power. Today was no different. Or so he thought. At the back of the courtroom, the doors swung open. A woman in a sleek black suit stepped in, moving with quiet authority. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew her presence alone demanded respect. Taking a seat in the gallery, her sharp eyes locked onto Daniels as he continued spewing his testimony. Daniels noticed her almost immediately. His gaze flickered with a mix of annoyance and condescension. Another black woman, probably someone's relative, hoping for a miracle. He smirked and turned back to the judge. Then she stood up. Daniels stiffened, narrowing his eyes. She wasn't just any courtroom observer. There was something about her, the way she held herself, that unsettled him. He didn't like it. "Sit down, lady," he barked, taking a few steps toward her. "This isn't your business." The woman met his glare, unmoved. "Excuse me." Daniels scoffed. He enjoyed these moments, making sure people like her knew their place. He moved closer, his voice dropping to a sneer. "You lost. This ain't the welfare office." A hush fell over the room. The judge's gavel hovered midair, shock plastered across his face. A few people audibly gasped. The woman, however, remained completely still. Her dark eyes, piercing and unreadable, never wavered. "Remove your hand," she said, her voice controlled but edged with unmistakable steel. Daniel's grip tightened around her arm. "Or what?" He spat, giving her a slight shove. The power trip surged through him. He could already picture her flustered response, the way she'd shrink away like so many others had. But she didn't. She simply reached into her jacket. Daniel's instincts flared. His muscles tensed, ready to react. He knew this move, someone reaching into their pocket, a sudden motion. He had drawn his gun for less. The entire room held its breath. She pulled out a badge. The air in the courtroom turned to ice. Daniel's smug grin evaporated. His face drained of color. His fingers slipped from her arm as he staggered back a step. The badge gleamed under the overhead lights, but not just any badge. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice calm but unyielding. "Officer Daniels, I am Chief Renee Carter," she announced, her words slicing through the silence like a blade. "And as of this morning, I am your new boss." The courtroom erupted. Daniels stood frozen in place, his lips parting, but no words came out. The weight of his actions, his arrogance, his unchecked power, came crashing down on him all at once. The judge's gavel finally came down, but it was drowned out by the whispers, the murmurs, the stunned realization that the world as Daniels knew it had just changed forever. A heavy silence hung over the courtroom. Officer Daniels' breath hitched, his mind scrambling to process what had just happened. His world, his unchecked power, had been built on the belief that people like her, black, composed, untouchable, didn't exist. His chief. Renee Carter stood tall, her badge still gleaming under the fluorescent light. Daniel's fingers twitched at his sides, his face contorting as he fought to regain control. The judge tapped his gavel. "Order in the court," he commanded, though even he couldn't mask the intrigue simmering beneath his voice. Renee turned to him. "Your Honor, I request a private discussion regarding Officer Daniels, both today and throughout his career. I believe it will be relevant to these proceedings." The judge hesitated, studying her. Daniels could practically feel the shift in the room. The power he once wielded was slipping through his fingers. "Very well, Chief Carter," the judge finally said. "We'll recess for 15 minutes. Daniels felt the air leave his lungs. The judge actually listened to her. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Renee turned, locking eyes with him. The intensity in her gaze made him feel smaller than he ever had in his entire career. Flashback, Renee's journey. Renee Carter hadn't always worn a badge. Born and raised in the very city that had failed so many, she had seen firsthand how the system worked against people who looked like her. Her father, a local pastor, had always preached justice, but he also knew justice was rare for black families in their neighborhood. At 16, Renee had watched as her older brother was pulled over for matching a description. She had stood frozen, clutching their mother's hand, as officers dragged him from his car, slammed him against the hood, and threw him in cuffs. He hadn't done anything wrong, but that hadn't mattered. That night had shaped her. She knew then that the only way to fight a corrupt system was to get inside it, to change it. Despite every obstacle, the racism in the academy, white officers doubting her authority, superiors questioning her decisions, she had climbed the ranks. And now, she was here, the first black female police chief in the city's history. And her first order of business? Cleaning out the rot. Back in the courtroom, Daniels paced the empty aisle, his pulse hammering in his throat. He needed to fix this. He had connections, people who had protected him for years. Grabbing his phone, he quickly dialed. "Yeah, it's me," he whispered when the line picked up. "We have a problem." Renee stood in a private room with the judge and the defense attorney. "Your Honor," she said, placing a thick folder on the table. "Before we continue Jamal's case, I want you to see something." The judge opened it. Inside were records, complaints, lawsuits, excessive force reports, all with one name. Attached to one name, Officer Daniels. The judge's face darkened. "Why haven't I seen this before?" "Because Daniels was protected," Renee answered simply. "But not anymore." A knock at the door. An officer stepped in, his face uneasy. "Chief Carter, you might want to see this." Renee followed him into the hallway. Outside the courthouse, reporters were already gathering. And at the center of it all, Daniels. Flanked by a lawyer and a few high-ranking officers, he was speaking into a microphone. "This is a political hit job," he declared. "I have done nothing wrong. I am being targeted because I uphold the law." Renee clenched her jaw. He was going to fight this. But that was fine, because she was ready. Renee stood at the courthouse entrance, watching the media circus unfold. Officer Daniels was already spinning his narrative, playing the victim, framing himself as a dedicated cop under attack. "This is what happens when you do your job," Daniels said, shaking his head in feigned frustration. "I've spent years protecting this city, putting criminals behind bars, and now, because of political games, my career is being destroyed." Renee's fists clenched at her sides. She had seen it before, how men like him twisted reality, turning themselves into martyrs. But this time, she wouldn't let the truth be buried. Inside the courthouse, the real battle began. As Renee re-entered the courtroom, her phone vibrated. A message from Internal Affairs. "Be careful. Daniels still has people protecting him." She sighed, already knowing this wouldn't be an easy fight. But she had prepared for this moment for years. The judge called the session back into order, his gaze flicking between Daniels and Renee. "Chief Carter, I've reviewed the documents you provided," he said. "These are serious allegations." Daniels leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his confidence returning. "Allegations, Your Honor," he said smoothly. "Nothing proven. And let's be honest, the chief here seems to have a personal vendetta against me." Renee stepped forward. "It's not personal, Officer Daniels. It's justice." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I request that all of Officer Daniels' previous excessive force cases be reopened, starting with the case of Jamal Brown." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Daniels' jaw tightened. The judge nodded. "I will take that into consideration. But I must warn you, Chief Carter, reopening these cases will be an uphill battle." Renee's expression remained firm. "I understand, Your Honor, but it's a battle worth fighting." Daniels strikes back. Daniels stormed out of the courthouse, his hands balled into fists. He could feel his power slipping away, and he would not let that happen. "Find me something on her," he barked into his phone as he walked. "Anything. I don't care if you have to dig up her kindergarten report card." A voice on the other end hesitated. "D. Daniels, you don't get it. This isn't just some political stunt. Carter's got evidence. Real evidence." Daniels sneered. "Then we make sure no one sees it." That night, a masked figure broke into the police department's internal evidence room. Files were pulled, computers wiped. By morning, the case against Daniels was thinner. But Renee had anticipated this. When she arrived at the station, she found her office ransacked. Papers scattered. A warning message on her desk. Back off. She picked up the paper, reading it slowly. Then she smiled. Daniels had just made a fatal mistake. She turned to her assistant. Give me a warrant. I know exactly where to look. The morning air was thick with tension as Renee stood outside the courthouse, her fingers wrapped around a fresh warrant. The break-in at the department's evidence room had been a desperate move. Daniels was panicking, and when men like him panicked, they got sloppy. Her gut told her Daniels had an insurance policy, a place where he kept the real dirt hidden, and she knew exactly where to look. A hidden case resurfaces. Renee and her team arrived at Daniels' off-duty storage unit, an unassuming metal door at a rundown facility on the outskirts of town. Armed with the warrant, she watched as officers cut the lock and pulled the door open. Inside were boxes of files, old case documents, and something chilling, a stack of old VHS tapes and USB drives, labeled with names. All victims of Officer Daniels. Daniels. Renee's breath caught in her throat as she picked up one labeled Marcus Avery, 2012. Marcus Avery, a name she knew well. A black teenager killed during a routine stop. Daniels had claimed he reached for a weapon, but Renee had always suspected there was more to the story. The case had been buried, deemed justified, with no body cam footage available. But now, the missing footage was right here. Her hands shook as she plugged the USB drive into her laptop. Her team huddled around her. The screen flickered to life. Daniel's body cam from that night. The truth was worse than she had imagined. The footage showed Daniels planting a gun on the boy's body, casually dropping a weapon next to Marcus's lifeless hand, then calling it in as if it were routine. No hesitation. No remorse. Just another cover-up in a long list of them. The room went silent. One of the officers, a young recruit, swallowed hard. Jesus Christ. Renee's jaw tightened. She had known Daniels was corrupt. But this was murder. And now, she had the proof to bring him down. Daniels begins to lose. Control slipping away. Meanwhile, Daniels sat in a dimly lit bar, swirling whiskey in his glass. His phone buzzed. It was his contact from the evidence room. We have a problem. Daniels stiffened. What do you mean? They found the tapes. They found everything. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the floor. No, that's impossible, he muttered. His mind raced. How could this be happening? His world, the world where he was untouchable, was crumbling. Renee makes her move. That evening, Renee stood on the steps of the precinct, holding a press conference. In my hands, she said, lifting the USB drive, is undeniable proof that Officer Daniels has been falsifying reports, planting evidence, and covering up his crimes, including the murder of Marcus Avery. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters scrambled to push their microphones forward. Watching from a distance, Daniels felt his stomach drop. She wasn't stopping. For the first time in his career, he had no way out. The press conference was everywhere. Every news channel, every headline, every social media platform flooded with the same shocking revelation: Officer Daniels exposed. Secret footage reveals murder cover-up. Renee stood firm as the cameras flashed, her voice steady as she continued. This is not just about one bad cop. This is about a system that allowed him to operate without consequence for years. That ends now. Daniels sat frozen in his car, parked in an empty lot on the outskirts of town. His phone buzzed nonstop, messages from fellow officers, his superiors, the union. Some were telling him to lay low. Others were cutting ties entirely. He clenched his jaw, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. They were abandoning him. The very system that had protected him for so long was turning its back on him. And then, the final blow. His lawyer called. Daniels, the voice on the other end said, hesitant. The department is moving to suspend you indefinitely, without pay. Daniels' stomach twisted. They can't do that, he hissed. I have connections. I have leverage. A pause. Then, the lawyer sighed. They're saying they have the video of Marcus Avery. Another pause. They're saying it's indisputable. Life. Daniels was truly alone. He slammed his fist against the dashboard, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. This wasn't happening. He needed a way out. Desperation breeds recklessness. Daniels stormed into his last stronghold, the police union office. He burst through the doors, demanding support. You can't just throw me to the wolves. he spat. I did what I had to do. The streets are safer because of me. But the men inside, the same ones who once laughed at his racist jokes and covered for his brutality, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them, an older officer, cleared his throat. Daniels, you need to get out in front of this. Deny it. Say the footage was edited. Say, are you serious? Daniels cut in, his voice cracking. You think a fake video is going to hold up? Carter has the public eating out of her damn hands. If we don't shut this down now, we're all next. Another officer shook his head. No, you're next. We're not risking our careers for you. Daniel's blood ran cold. They were done protecting him. For the first time in his life, he was truly alone. For the first time, Daniels felt powerless. Renee pushes harder. But Renee wasn't done. That night, she issued an official warrant for Daniels' arrest. As officers arrived at his house, banging on the door, Daniels was already gone. A full-blown manhunt was now underway. Renee's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number popped up. You think you've won? This isn't over. She smirked, locking her phone. Oh, but it was only just beginning. The city was on high alert. News stations ran breaking reports. Fugitive cop on the run after murder cover-up exposed. Helicopters hovered above as officers combed the streets. Every highway checkpoint, every airport, every bus station, monitored. Daniels had nowhere to go. But Renee knew him. She knew exactly where he'd run. A man with nothing to lose. Daniel's world had collapsed in a matter of hours. The system he had trusted had discarded him. The same powerful friends who had covered for him now refused to return his calls. His hands trembled as he gripped the senses sharp. Every muscle in her body coiled like a spring. The stolen car's steering wheel was still warm from Daniel's grip, sweat rolling down his face as he realized. His career, his reputation, his entire life were gone. But there was one thing left. Revenge. The trap was set. Renee stood outside an abandoned warehouse near the docks, her pulse steady. She had anticipated this moment. Daniels was too arrogant to run forever. He wouldn't go out quietly. Her phone rang. I know you're looking for me, Carter. Daniel's voice rasped through the speaker. But you don't know how this ends. Renee didn't blink. I do, actually. It ends with you in cuffs. A cruel chuckle. You think you've won? You think bringing me down changes anything? The system made me. And when I'm gone, someone just like me will take my place. Renee's jaw tightened. No, Daniels. The system let you exist. But change starts today. A rustling sound. Then, the line went dead. She exhaled slowly. He was close. The final showdown. Inside the warehouse, Daniels crouched behind a stack of crates, his stolen service weapon clutched tightly in his hands. Footsteps echoed through the vast, dimly lit space. Renee had come alone. Good. She stepped forward, senses sharp, ready for the fight that would decide everything. Silhouette sharp, unwavering. Daniels. It's over. Daniels' voice was low, shaking with rage. You ruined my life. Renee shook her head. No, you did that. A tense silence. Then, Daniels lunged from the shadows, gun raised. Bang. A single gunshot echoed through the warehouse. Daniels staggered back, his gun clattering to the floor. A red stain spread across his shoulder, his breathing turning ragged as he collapsed against a crate. Renee's gun remained steady in her hands. I told you it was over. Police sirens wailed outside. Officers flooded in, surrounding Daniels as he slumped to his knees. For the first time, he had no power, no control. One of the arresting officers read him his rights, the same words Daniels had coldly recited to countless innocent men before. As they dragged him away, he lifted his head, locking eyes with Renee one last time. Pure hatred. But beneath it, fear. And for Renee, victory. Not just for her. For every victim Daniels thought would never get justice. The interrogation. Daniels sat in the cold interrogation room, his once pristine. Enough to cut through his bravado. I think, she said calmly, you're not as untouchable as you thought. Daniel's smirk faltered. His hands twitched against the cuffs, but he masked it with a scoff. I don't break that easy. Renee didn't flinch. She flipped another page. You already have. The file laid out everything. Every cover-up, every life destroyed under his watch. He had spent years wielding fear like a weapon, certain no one would ever hold him accountable. But now he was the one waiting. The DA's patience won't last forever, Renee said. Neither will your allies. She leaned back, her gaze unwavering. You're not getting out of this, Daniels. The only question is how much worse you want it to get. Silence stretched between them. Daniels exhaled sharply, eyes flickering to the file, then to her. He wasn't ready to break. Not yet. But Renee saw it, the cracks forming, the weight settling. It was only a matter of time. Silent as the verdict echoed through the courtroom. Guilty. His smirk was gone. His bravado shattered. Renee's words had been right. His own had abandoned him the second he became a liability. The union, his fellow officers, his connections, all gone. For the first time, he was truly alone. The courtroom, the final reckoning. Weeks later, the courtroom was packed. News cameras lined the back. Citizens and activists filled the seats. And at the center of it all, Daniels, standing trial for his crimes. The prosecution laid out the case with brutal efficiency. The body cam footage, the testimonies, the forged reports. There was no escape. Jamal Brown, the young man Daniels had falsely arrested at the very beginning, took the stand. His voice was steady. This man treated me like I was nothing, Jamal said. But today, I'm here to make sure no one else suffers like I did. From the front row, Renee watched, hands clasped. This was justice, not revenge. Justice. And when the guilty verdict was read, a wave of emotion rippled through the room. Daniels had finally fallen. The aftermath, a system begins to change. Daniels was down just one man, she said, her voice firm. This was about changing the system that let him exist in the first place. A new beginning. Daniels was sentenced to 25 years without parole. His fall sent shockwaves through the department, a wave of reform, resignations, and long overdue investigations into corruption. For the first time in years, people believed change was possible. Outside the courthouse, Renee breathed in the crisp air. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but she ignored them. Instead, she turned to Jamal, standing beside his mother. You did good today, she said. Jamal nodded. So did you. She smiled. This was just the beginning. As the sun dipped low in the sky, Renee stepped away from the courthouse, the weight of the trial finally lifting. The fight had been long, the scars deep, but today, justice had prevailed. Daniels was gone, not just from the force, but from the system that had shielded him for years. No more cover-ups. No more lies. Reporters swarmed, microphones shoved in her direction. Chief Carter, how does it feel to bring down Officer Daniels? One asked. Renee paused. She could have said it felt good. She could have talked about victory. But instead, she looked straight into the camera. This was never about bringing down just one man. This was about changing the system that let him exist in the first place. It was about holding a system accountable, she said firmly. A system that let him exist. The cameras flashed. The world was listening. Renee turned, walking down the courthouse steps, past the people who had fought alongside her, past Jamal and his family, past the young black kids who now saw a new future. A future where justice wasn't just a promise, but a reality. As she reached her car, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. One down. Many more to go. Renee exhaled. The fight wasn't over. But change had begun. And this was just the first domino to fall.